Hello there, this is James Uscroft, EuJames1978, and continuing on from the previous video in this series, links down as the underbar, one of the most important things to understand about all political, social, economic, human rights and civil rights issues is that when what we know as the right and the far right talk about rights, liberty, freedom and what have you, what they actually mean are power and convenience, specifically their own personal power over those who they feel are naturally subordinate to them, and the convenience of not being challenged or made to feel bad about that power in any way, shape, form or fashion. Because as Corey Robin explains in his book The Reactionary Mind, while almost everyone believes that what we know as the left is fighting for equality while the right is fighting for freedom, what the right is actually fighting for is the maintenance, reinforcement and expansion of hierarchies which guarantee freedom for the higher orders to have control over the lower orders, meaning those who they perceive as their natural subordinates. Being willing to tolerate democracy in the public sphere only so long as it doesn't threaten their dominance over the private sphere, with husbands ruling over their wives, fathers over their children, employers over their employees, parents dictating what their children can and cannot be taught in schools and what have you, and above all, no one else, especially not uppity inferiors, violating the sanctity of the private sphere by questioning their dominance or even implying that they might be the cause of any particular problem. And when you understand this, all of the massive self-contradictory and self-serving hypocrisy of self-proclaimed libertarians and everyone else on what we know as the right and the far right, such as free market economics suddenly becoming socialist tyranny when workers are refusing to be exploited in low-wage jobs, finally make perfect sense, because as I've been explaining throughout this series, the issue is not whether a government is tyrannical or democratic, raises taxes or lowers them, imposes regulations, relaxes those regulations, increases the national debt or any other political talking point, but whatever makes you feel threatened at that time, with big government simply being anything related to government which makes you feel threatened in that moment under those particular circumstances, while small government is anything that does not. After all, it's not paying money to the government in and of itself, wasteful big government spending, or giving handouts to the undeserving that people resent, because if they were, then paying corporations through the nose for services that the governments of other countries provide for a fraction of the price, the obscene amount wasted in the US military every single year, and the practice of simply giving the most profitable corporations on earth billions of dollars of taxpayers' money simply because those corporations bribe politicians would be at the top of their hit list.
Studies have shown that endorsement of a conspiracy theory is a form of motivated, false reasoning that is used to protect an individual's pre-existing worldview. Studies have also shown that conservative voters are more susceptible to conspiracy theories than any other bloc of voters in the United States. Most observers interpret this data as due to a strain of anti-government sentiment among conservatives and how many conspiracy theories involve the government. Conservative mistrust of the federal government is the product of conservative politicians sowing that mistrust, but not for any of the reasons conservative voters are told. Conservative politicians' condemnation of the federal government has nothing to do with any of the actual egregious actions by the state. No, conservative politicians' condemnation of the federal government has everything to do with money. The federal government regulates capitalism through safety laws, minimum wage laws, tax laws, environmental laws, and so forth. And conservative politicians and their donors don't want that. Their presentation of the government is only the part of the government that hinders capitalism. Conservative politicians don't have a problem with the government. They have a problem with anything that is not laissez-faire capitalism. The part of the government that enforces capitalism, meaning the police and the military, are not included in this presentation of the government to their voters.
Instead, from opposing gun control to denying the very existence of COVID and vaccine denial in general, it's all about being more afraid of the government having power over you, of it violating the sanctity of the private sphere in that one specific area, than you are of the thing that's literally killing people by the thousands, with paradoxically many of the same people who cheer obscene military overspending and gross police overfunding because it makes them feel superior and keeps the inferior outsiders at bay, also arming themselves in preparation for the moment when the tyrannical big government kicks their door down and tries to take away their gas stoves, because in defiance of what libertarians, fiscal conservatives and others claim to believe, the opposite of a nanny state is not the absence of government, but a daddy state, which is to say a fascist police state which empowers you and makes you feel special, giving you full power in the private sphere, while protecting your property rights by keeping your inferiors in their place. With once again, though, the caveat being that because it's all entirely emotional and the only thing you care about is feeling special, whether you're actually free or being oppressed as well, being completely and utterly irrelevant. Hence the very same people who spent 8 years condemning Obama as a tyrant either failing to bat an eyelid or even openly cheering when Trump declared that, as president, Article 2 of the Constitution gave him unconditional authority to do whatever he wanted, including sending unidentified federal agents in unmarked cars to illegally detain protesters without due process, and then inciting a violent insurrection to overturn the results of an election that he lost, eagerly sliding down the libertarian to fascist pipeline even when their Emperor God King was letting their loved ones die of the COVID he condemned as a Chinese hoax and a democratic plot to unseat him as president, because 99 times out of 100, a libertarian, small government Republican, anarcho-capitalist, or whatever they choose to call themselves, is merely a fascist who hasn't figured out yet that what they want is for the government to tread on everyone who they feel should be beneath them. Because whether they admit it or not, the only way to maintain their dominance over the private sphere is for a police state to keep the uppity inferiors in their place and protect their property rights, whether they realise it or not, this being what they actually mean when they use the comforting sounding euphemism of the night watchman state, and that in reality, even if the government does end up treading on them as well, then they're perfectly okay with that too, just as long as it reassures them that they're special and treads on the inferiors a little harder. After all, as I discussed in part 4 of this video series, and the existence of drained pool politics proves in spades, referring to a time in the Deep South when local governments literally drained their public swimming pools, shut down their public schools, and denied themselves access to other services rather than be forced to desegregate them, people are genuinely willing to sacrifice and suffer needlessly merely to maintain the conceit of being superior to what's labelled as the inferior outgroup, and right now in 2023, while we talk and argue endlessly about the economics of Medicare for All, pointing out that it will cost less than the current healthcare system, that any increase in taxation will be offset by the massive savings in premiums, co-pays, and so on and so forth, the bottom line is that people condemn the idea of universal healthcare as socialist, not because of economics, but because allowing big government, to have power over their healthcare makes them feel threatened, while being at the mercy of corporations who are robbing them blind does not, and worse, because the idea of sharing the system with immigrants, poor black people, work-shy scroungers, and everyone else who they regard as inferior makes them feel icky inside.
And if you are a lower-class white person, at the bottom of the top tier of the racial caste system, who has absorbed our society's message that white people are superior to black people and deserve a privileged status in society as a result, you're being set up for constant disappointment. Because in the course of your life, you will see many, many examples of members of this supposedly inferior race and or culture excel in ways that you are not excelling. For many lower-class white people, it doesn't look like a privilege to them. This could have something to do with the fact that over recent years, there's been a surge of deaths within the undereducated white working class population, largely due to what authors Anne Case and Angus Deaton call deaths of despair. deaths from alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicide. Wouldn't it be nice to let go of that burden? And beyond the emotional and psychological costs of racism to white people, there are incredibly significant material costs. Study after study has shown that when white people think that a government program helps a lot of black people or other people of color, they're more likely to oppose it. This is why we can't have nice things. And while a disproportionate number of black people benefit from social safety net programs because, systemic racism makes black people more likely to be poor and live in areas of concentrated poverty with fewer options for upward mobility, the majority of the people that participate in these programs are white. According to the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities, in 2014, 6.2 million working-age white people were lifted above the poverty line by government safety net programs, compared to 2.8 million black people. In 2015, over 40% of food stamp recipients were white, and in 2016, white people made up 43% of Medicaid recipients. I hope you get my point. A large number of white people oppose policies that help lots of white people. Why is that? Heather McGhee tells the story of the Oak Park Pool in Montgomery, Alabama, one of the many public amenities funded by tax dollars in the era of the New Deal. Yet, this public good suffered a tragic fate as a function of the backlash to the end of segregation.
It was the meeting place for the town, except the Oak Park Pool, though it was funded by all of Montgomery's citizens, was for whites only. When a federal court finally deemed this unconstitutional, the reaction of the town council was swift. Effective January 1st, 1959, they decided they would drain the public pool rather than let black families swim too.
This is a good metaphor for how racism is bad for everyone. A metaphor that also actually happened. It's true that white people have a privileged status in the racial caste system, but that privilege is only in comparison to the subjected group, and the efforts to maintain this dynamic hold everyone down. No one can enjoy the Oak Park Pool any longer, not even Joe Biden or his good friend Corn Pop. But by contrast, striving for racial equality actually improves the lives of everybody. Consider the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau, established during Reconstruction to help the formerly enslaved people following the Civil War, established a public school system that served both black and white children and would lay the foundation for public education in the former Confederate States. Or consider how Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has also protected the rights of women and members of the LGBTQ community, most of whom were white. Just think about how overhauling our policing system, reforming our criminal legal system, ending mass incarceration, expanding our social safety net, and investing in the housing, healthcare, education, and general welfare of all of our citizens would benefit everyone today, including white people. The truth is that the best way to address racial inequality is with a progressive agenda. And the best way to implement a progressive agenda that helps everyone is by creating a multiracial coalition dedicated to dismantling systemic racism and economic inequality. Eradicating systemic racism would be the right thing to do, even if it didn't help white people. But the fact that it does kind of makes it a pretty easy decision, right?
Similarly, while we explain ad nauseum that expanding the social safety net, introducing the universal basic income, and simply giving homeless people housing is the solution to countless social problems and will cost far less than endlessly pouring money into prisons and the police, like the people who whine endlessly about the possibility of cancelling all student debt because they've already paid theirs off, people who work hard and bought their own home and so forth merely feel threatened by the fact that if we simply give the inferior outgroup money, housing, and what have you, then they won't get to feel special anymore, because owning your own home will no longer be an earned achievement. But as I mentioned earlier though, handing out hundreds of millions to some of the most profitable corporations on the planet because reasons, no, they don't see that as a problem at all, because it doesn't threaten their feeling of self-righteous superiority.
It would be easy to say that this country hates poor people, and I mean, yeah, that's true. But it's also worth thinking about the fact that our society goes to extraordinary measures to make sure that poor people stay poor. If we truly hated poor people so much, wouldn't we want there to be fewer poor people by, like, giving them money or something to make sure they're no longer poor? But the truth is that America loves poor people. America needs poor people. They need them the same way that the Joker needs Batman, if Batman was a single black mother on welfare, which I'm pretty sure he isn't. I haven't kept up with the comics. I don't care for that woke stuff in my comics. I like it back in the day when there was no woke stuff. And America needs poor people, not just because it makes money from them, but because a lot of people want the prospect of poverty in our society to serve as a motivator for the working class. It's the carrot or the stick, right? Maybe you'll get rich one day, but in the meantime, you better work hard or else you'll be poor. It's this.
That'll show those poor.
Why are you cheering, Fry? You're not rich.
True, but someday I might be rich, and then people like me better watch their step.
But of course, the secret lurking behind the carrot and stick analogy is that there are plenty of carrots to go around if it weren't for the people hoarding all the carrots, you know? That's why I'm suspicious of every horse. Something to think about. And so again, why is being poor so expensive? Because we designed it that way. The system is not broken, it is working as intended. This entire video has essentially just been a description of the inner workings of capitalism, a framework that intentionally encourages and rewards the act of squeezing every last drop of profit you can from anywhere and anyone you can, particularly the most vulnerable, who uncoincidentally don't have the means to fight back. And part of the reason this is all able to persist is because the many myths that serve to uphold capitalism obscure the unfairness inherent in the system and justify the intrinsic exploitation and coercion at the heart of it all. A rich person earned what they achieved, and a poor person deserves what they get. And to be clear, when I say myths, I mean lies. I mean false promises. Because the promise that all you need to do in order to succeed in this country is work hard is contradicted by the fact that the greatest predictor of whether or not you will grow up to be rich or poor is whether or not your family was rich or poor. And this fact alone pretty much destroys the myth that our current system of capitalism is an apparatus that upholds the ideal of equal opportunity. And while capitalist stands love talking about equality of opportunity over the dreaded equality of outcome, the latter is clearly the answer in this case. Though no mainstream politician is actually advocating for equality of outcome, the fact is that creating outcomes that are more equal is one of the best ways to create more equality of opportunity. We literally just saw this happen with the stimulus checks and child tax credits. And we've seen it happen time and time again in the various guaranteed income test cases. That shit works. And so the only reason someone wouldn't want it is because they like the fact that poor people are punished. And I don't know, I think that's bad. I think we should be aiming for a society devoid of poverty altogether.
Going back to my earlier point about the polar opposite treatment of Trump and Obama, in fact, it's vital to remember that in 99.99% of cases, whether or not reactionary regressives condemn you as a tyrant, a parasite living off the taxpayer, or otherwise feel existentially threatened by your existence, depends entirely on what you are, not what you do. That regardless of how #civil and moderate he was, no matter how much he destroyed his own party and the middle class, paving the way for the rise of Trump by giving the Republicans absolutely everything they ever wanted in the name of centrism, compromise, and reaching across the aisle, and whitewashed every aspect of his identity to convince white voters that he wasn't a threat, Obama was still more feared and hated than any other president in history because he was an uppity black man who didn't know his place. And as if the universe was going out of its way to prove the point by contrasting him with the most extreme polar opposite example, he was immediately succeeded by the most uncivil, illiterate, abusive, hateful, corrupt, divisive, incompetent, unstable, and dangerous president in American history who has absolutely no regard for democracy or the rule of law, but who is still championed as a hero by the very same people who condemned Obama as a tyrant because he is one of them. Of course, many of us have been racking our brains since 2015 asking how on earth an alleged billionaire who was born with the entire contents of a silver cutlery drawer in his mouth can possibly be regarded as a man of the people and one of us by the very voters who he's grifting by yelling about the crimes, excesses and evils of the elite, because surely Trump is a member of that elite by any objective standard, and the answer is quite simply that as an angry old white man who hates everyone they hate, Trump makes his worshippers feel empowered and heard, on top of which the fact that he's a rich white man means that it's natural for him to be in power, whereas that communist Kenyan Muslim, on the other hand, the only way he could possibly have won those presidential elections was through vote rigging and hashtag reverse racism. Ooh.
Tennessee is the state where the Klan was founded on Christmas Eve in 1865 by Nathan Bedford Forrest. Tennessee also had a statue for Nathan Bedford Forrest on the side of the I-65 in Nashville up until 2021. Tennessee also had a Nathan Bedford Forrest bust in the state capitol in Nashville, Tennessee until 2021. So when Democratic reps in Tennessee, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, are expelled for protesting and standing in solidarity with our children and our parents who are against gun violence, it's not that so-called white supremacy is on the rise. It's not that democracy is eroding. It's that so-called white supremacy has always been here. It's never gone away. And it's that democracy has never fully been here in the first place, especially for black folks. What we actually have and have always had is a plutocracy, a government for the wealthy. And to be more specific, a racial patriarchal plutocracy, a government for wealthy white men. That has been the status quo, and that status quo must change. We got to keep organizing, y'all. The Confederate side has never stopped fighting.
In short then, just as in the minds of such people, big government, is merely anything to do with government which makes them feel threatened and uncomfortable in that moment under those specific circumstances, in their minds as well, from the boogeyman of the Jews to the Democrats who supposedly only win elections by allowing illegal immigrants to vote, the elite is merely anyone, often but not always a member of the inferior outgroup, who they fear has undeserved power over them, and worse, is giving undeserved power to their inferiors to violate the private sphere. This in fact being many reactionary regressives' answer to the paradox of how the naturally inferior outgroup can ever possibly pose any kind of threat to them, namely the conspiracy theory that the elite who have undeserved power are giving that power to the inferior outgroup in order to destroy superior civilization out of spite, quite literally by hurting the superior in-group's feelings, which is to say, by using what they condemn as white guilt and liberal guilt to shame the naturally superior into giving up their superiority. As a brief side note, in fact, this is also the reason why Trump's base insists that they support him because he's honest, when in reality he's lied more than any other president in history, because in their minds the issue isn't facts, truth or reality, but rather the eternal struggle between the naturally superior who deserve to have power and the inferior outgroup who can only ever steal power through lies and deception, including by playing the race card or otherwise playing upon so-called white guilt and liberal guilt. In other words, to them, Trump is honest because he's one of us who also hates those slimy globalists, East Coast elites and jumped-up inferiors who are taking what's rightfully ours, and who, instead of being dishonest in the name of civility or hashtag political correctness, will openly accuse them and attack them to their face. So to state it even more plainly, the self-righteous conceit that he's telling it like it is makes him the champion of everyone who's ever wanted to yell at an uppity inferior to get back in their place because straight, white, cisgendered Christian Americans really are superior and they actually are degenerate perverts and or inferior outsiders who are only tolerated at their sufferance, but who has hesitated to do so for fear of cancel culture or whatever else they're calling common decency and consequences for your actions these days. Hence all of the rhetoric about Trump being a fighter and evangelical Christians explaining away their hypocrisy by declaring that they were voting for a commander-in-chief, not a pastor-in-chief, because literally all they wanted at the end of the day was someone to yell at the people who they hate.
Right-wing conspiracy theorists believe in birtherism not because the evidence is compelling, but because the theory feels culturally true to them. It reinforces their pre-existing political belief about the duplicity of anyone to their left, and their pre-existing racist belief about the criminality of African Americans. Endorsement of a conspiracy theory is a form of motivated, false reasoning that is used to protect an individual's pre-existing worldview. In recent years, that traditional conspiracy theory model has been turned on its head. Now, a conspiracy theory can flourish even without the half-truth or the real event. Instead, a conspiracy theory can gain a great deal of traction simply through repetition, by being adopted by someone in a position of power, or both. In their book, A Lot of People Are Saying, authors Nancy L. Rosenblum and Russell Muirhead described this new conspiracism as conspiracy without the theory.
Going back to what I explained at the beginning of this video then, bearing in mind how these I'm not fascist butts will only tolerate democracy in the public sphere as long as they still dominate the private sphere, a good working definition of the elite in the minds of such people is anyone who is perceived as a threat to the dominance of the superior in-group in the private sphere, even if it's literally only by gaining too much undeserved power in the public sphere by being uppity and not knowing their place. And following on from Obama in every possible sense of the word, the go-to example of this phenomenon was Hillary Clinton, arguably the most feared and hated candidate for President of the United States in American history, merely because she was an uppity woman who didn't know her place and tried to force her way into a position where she #didn't belong. Because just as the mere existence of trans women makes transphobic lesbians feel pressured into having sex with them, not because the trans women themselves are doing anything at all, but because their mere existence challenges the comforting bigotry that they'll never have sex with a man, or at the very least, never have sex with a man again, around which they've built their entire identity as lesbians. Seeing a black man and or white woman in the Oval Office forces I'm not racist and or misogynistic butts to question the assumptions on which they've built their entire sense of superiority, since after all, by their very existence as presidents, the black man and or white woman raises the terrifying possibility that white men are not inherently superior, creating the fear that other uppity womenfolk and or people of colour will begin pushing their way into and demanding control over every other aspect of their lives as well, with society doing nothing to stop them because by electing them president in the first place, the rest of society has demonstrated that they don't care about your economic anxiety and other legitimate concerns.
In the minds of conspiracy theorists, centrist politicians like Hillary Clinton transform into revolutionary figures who want to open borders and change the racial demographics of the nation. Donors like George Soros transform into radicals who want to change the Christian demographics of the nation. The right does not fear the government, they fear sabotage from within. The sabotage of the United States and its traditions, its hierarchies. And they are so terrified of this potential change in the status quo that milquetoast politicians like Joe Biden are seen as communist devil worshippers. The threat that they allegedly pose to their strict social hierarchy, their God-given natural law, motivates belief in the unbelievable.
As a matter of fact, you may have noticed that this is the mirror opposite of the absurd claims that Obama's election proves that America can't possibly be racist anymore, and the Tory party electing 3 token female prime ministers and appointing 1 token brown one proves that they can't possibly be misogynistic or racist, claims which are often made by the very same people who shit their pants with rage and sent rape and death threats over the fact that the Disney Star Wars trilogy featured an Asian woman, because bearing in mind that the issue is always whether or not they have the final say over where the line is drawn. As I explained it at length in part 5 of this video series, links down in the underbar, the difference between tokenism and genuine representation is whether the "I'm not bigoted but" in question feels threatened, and what they fear poses the greatest threat to them at that moment. Because, just to clarify, the only time that you'll ever hear people argue that the election of Obama proves that America can't possibly be racist anymore is when the uppity black folk who don't know their place are making them feel uncomfortable and posing a more immediate threat. So in response to this perceived threat, "I'm not racist but" instinctively play the Obama card, because no different from other white supremacist myths such as the model minority, they can use him as a token to avoid losing too much ground.
Yedra, this is not a good thing, y'all. What this actually is part of his strategy to propagate white cis het dominant culture. And I'm going to need my fellow Asians to witness what this is for what it actually is. It is leveraging the model minority myth, one of white dominant culture's favorite weapons. So much so that they created it specifically to drive a wedge between Black and Asian communities. Why do you think the very man who is suppressing the teaching of Black history and the rights of queer and trans folks is suddenly promoting the teaching of Asian American history? Think about it for a minute, and also think about what kind of Asian history is actually going to be covered. We know it's not going to cover the friendship and movement work of Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama. We know they're not going to talk about Grace Lee Boggs, the Third World Liberation Front, or many of the other ways that Black and Asian communities have come up in solidarity in resistance against white dominant culture. And they're definitely not going to talk about all of the global Asian movements that rose up against authoritarianism and white dominant culture colonialism. I mean, you can imagine how they're going to cover Vietnam, the Korean War. They're certainly not going to talk about the U.S.'s historic role in the oppression of Hawaii or the U.S.'s history in Laos. What the history will probably cover is anti-Chinese sentiment, forced ally governments, white savior narratives, and the suppression of the immense history of Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander resistance. All of this is simply to further fragment people of the global majority, because by doing so, he and others like him that are doing so now in many different states are able to further white dominant cishet culture. So my fellow Asians, do not align yourself with white dominant culture, because it will be our downfall. And do not allow our community to be used as a wedge again, but instead let's remember and learn from our true histories of resistance against white dominant culture and colonialism. So he's going to allow the teaching of Asian American history? Well, my fellow Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacifica folks, let's show them our history by making history.
In other words, when the "I'm not bigoted buts" are crying from the rooftops that the very existence of an uppity outsider who doesn't know their place is proof of a culture war, or even a literal war to exterminate straight white cisgendered men, then that's actual representation. And when they're insisting that the good one who doesn't make them feel threatened or uncomfortable anymore proves that society is equal now and they can't possibly be bigots, so shut up, you communist agitator, then that's tokenism.
Let this serve as another reminder that the phrase "representation matters" is an incomplete sentence. The complete sentence should really say, representation matters if and only if you represent the will of the people. And by the people, I mean those who are disenfranchised, those who are the targets of racism, those who are the targets of capitalism, those who are the targets of sexism, those who are the targets of homophobia, those who are the targets of Islamophobia and every other phobia. Otherwise, your representation is just white supremacy and blackface. See, if we end the statement with "representation matters" without adding any context, we're truly only speaking to a child who doesn't understand the nuances of how systems work and oppress people. This is why we need something new. Rest in peace, Tyree Nichols.
Far beyond Hillary as well then, before Ilhan Omar and AOC even opened their mouths, their mere existence as brown women in Congress who didn't actively go out of their way to reassure them that "I'm one of the good ones" would have been enough to give many "I'm not racist" or misogynistic butts an aneurysm. And outside of politics and business as well, even when the supposed elite have absolutely no power in the public sphere whatsoever, it's the perception that these uppity inferiors are threatening the private sphere Inferior, where the superior are supposed to have unquestioned and absolute authority that triggers the backlash, or should I say, the front lash against them, since they're lashing out against what they perceive as a potential future threat. Because like the scout ant being the warning sign that the picnic will be ruined within 10 minutes unless you squash it there and then, it wasn't the sight of Colin Kaepernick taking the knee which posed any kind of actual threat, but rather the fear that unless they silenced him there and then, he would be the inspiration for hundreds or even thousands of uppity inferiors to challenge the "I'm not racist but" conceit that they are the superior good guys, the notion upon which, like the divine right of kings, the entire conceit that they deserve control over the lower orders is based. To date, in fact, the two best examples of this phenomenon remain Greta Thunberg and Anita Sarkeesian, two women who sent half of the men on the internet into an apoplectic rage by merely pointing out that this is a bad thing and we should do something about it, a perceived violation of the private sphere which committed the mortal sin of an uppity inferior raising the possibility of their natural superiors being the bad guy, triggering everything from rape and death threats to conspiracy theories about how, like Obama, they are the puppets of a global conspiracy orchestrated by the elite, to destroy Western civilization by hurting their delicate feelings, because, as I'll explain in part 7 of this video series, the worst threat that you can ever possibly pose to someone who feels threatened by the thought of social justice, equality, and social progress is to even inadvertently and indirectly raise the possibility that they might not be the good guy.
Hi, I'm a middle-aged man with an embarrassing problem. I get irrationally angry at a Swedish girl who wants to save the planet. Luckily, there's now a number I can call.
Hello, you've called the Greta Thunberg helpline.
If you're a grown adult who needs to yell at a child for some reason, the Greta Thunberg helpline is here to tolerate you.
She's just fueling needless anxiety. She's making the end of the world sound like it's the end of the world.
This whole charade's gone too far. Now I see she's speaking in front of a mock UN.
So that was the real UN.
So before you go full caps lock in an article comment section, let our expert counsellors assess your situation.
Sir, I just need to ask you some questions before we get started. Is your Twitter profile picture an egg?
Yeah, but I just don't have any good photos of my face.
We'll listen, no matter how ridiculous you sound.
Well, if she really is such a nice, sweet, caring Swedish girl, how come she can't help me assemble my Billy bookcase?
Yeah, but if she's so concerned about renewable energy, how come she doesn't wear one of those baseball caps with the solar panels and the fan on the front?
They said this Ladybird film was a comedy. Well, I didn't laugh once.
Sir, I think you're after the Greta Gerwig helpline.
99% on Rotten Tomatoes. 99%.
I'll patch you through.
It's okay. We understand that children acting like adults can make adults act like children.
I think if I'm honest, I'm just jealous that she got a free cruise to America.
Oh, so she actually sailed there herself.
Well, I don't know why she gets to fist bump Obama when I've never gotten to.
Have you considered launching your own significant global movement?
But it's so much easier to shit on someone else's.
We shouldn't be listening to a child. We should be listening to an expert.
Oh, right. Would you want me to put you through to an expert? Hello?
The Greta Thunberg helpline, because when it comes to climate change, we all know she's the real problem.